When I look back at the world as it stood in the year 1914, I often find myself pausing for a long moment. It was an age that carried itself with a remarkable sense of confidence. Cities glowed with electric light, factories hummed with new machines. People spoke with pride about progress, science, and the certainty that humanity was marching toward a brighter future. On the surface, it all felt steady and modern, as if civilization had finally found its solid footing, and yet, beneath that polished exterior, tensions moved quietly like pressure beneath a fault line. The world seemed peaceful, but it was a kind of peace that fooled almost everyone living in it. Even today, as an old historian reflecting on that time, it is hard to believe that a single moment, almost accidental in its details, could shatter the old order of the world so completely. When we try to understand how such a great conflict began, it is tempting to search for one dramatic cause, one villain, or one mistake that brought everything crashing down. But history rarely works that way. Wars of that scale are not born from a single spark. They rise from layers of tension built slowly over decades, often ignored or misunderstood until it is too late. And the story of the First World War is exactly that kind of story. The tale I want to share with you now is not only about bombs or battles. It is about the quiet decisions, the pride, the ambitions, and the blind spots that humanity overlooked at the very moment when it needed clarity the most. To understand what happened in 1914, we must begin with the rapid industrialization that swept across Europe in the late 19th century. Germany, a young and ambitious nation unified only a few decades earlier, grew at a pace that startled its neighbors. Its factories produced steel and machinery at levels that soon surpassed even Great Britain, the long-standing industrial leader. As German industry expanded, so did its confidence and its desire to claim a greater place in the world. Germany built a powerful navy, not just to defend its coast, but to project strength on the world stage. This, of course, unsettled Britain deeply. Britain had ruled the seas for generations, and now a rising power was challenging that balance. The result was a quiet competition, a naval race that increased suspicion on both sides. At the same time, far to the southeast, the Balkan region was boiling with a very different kind of energy. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a vast, aging structure that held within it many different peoples and cultures. But many of those groups no longer wanted to be ruled by Vienna. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, and others dreamed of independence. Serbia, in particular, imagined a future known as Greater Serbia, a nation that would unite the Slavic peoples of the region. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavs, supported these aspirations. This complicated mixture of national pride, resentment, and foreign influence made the Balkans a place where even a small incident could escalate beyond control. And surrounding all of this was a system of alliances that tied the great powers together like rows of dominoes. Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy formed what was called the Triple Alliance. In response, Britain, France, and Russia formed the Triple Entente. These alliances were meant to preserve peace through mutual protection, but in reality they created a situation where any conflict, even a local one, could quickly draw in half of Europe. It was a structure built on mistrust, one that looked stable only because no one pushed it too hard. Looking back with the perspective of age, the lesson feels painfully clear. People believed they were in control. They believed that modern progress had made the world safer, smarter, more predictable. But history shows us again and again that when nations overestimate their own wisdom and underestimate the consequences of their pride, tragedy often follows. That was the world in 1914, a world certain of its stability, unaware of the storm it had already set in motion. When we turn our attention to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the moment that set the world on a path it could not turn back from, it is important to remember that nothing about that day began with certainty. The forces that converged in Sarajevo were born from years of anger, disappointment, and restless dreams held by the younger generation of the Balkans. Among those young men was a secret nationalist group that called itself the Black Hand. They were idealists in the most dangerous sense of the word. convinced that the liberation of their people justified any action, no matter how violent. Their members were young, many still in their teens, and they carried with them the fervor that only youth and desperation can produce. They believed deeply that the only way to break the grip of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was to strike a symbolic blow at its heart. The Black Hand spent months preparing for the assassination. They smuggled weapons across the border, trained the young men who volunteered for the mission, and studied the route of the Archduke's visit. Yet for all their planning, the execution itself was a sequence of mistakes and misjudgments. On the morning of the attack, one of the conspirators threw a bomb at the Archduke's car. The bomb struck the folded roof of the vehicle, bounced off, and exploded beneath the car behind it. Officers in that second car were wounded, and the Archduke's driver sped away. The young assassin who had thrown the bomb was captured almost immediately. The others, scattered along the route, watched the motorcade vanish and believed that the entire mission had failed before it had even begun. In their minds, history had simply refused to cooperate. But fate, as history often reminds us, does not always follow the same logic as human plans. Later that day, the Archduke made a decision driven by compassion. He insisted on visiting the officers who had been injured by the bomb, and he ordered his driver to take him to the hospital. It was a simple act of kindness, but it altered the course of the century. On the way there, the driver took a wrong turn onto a narrow street. Realizing the mistake, he attempted to reverse the car, and in doing so, brought it to a stop directly in front of a small cafe. Outside that cafe stood Gavrilo Princip, one of the young conspirators who had earlier believed the mission was over. He had no expectation of seeing the Archduke again, yet there the car was motionless, only a few feet away. The moment was brief, but its impact was immeasurable. Princip stepped forward and fired his pistol at the Archduke and his wife. Within minutes, both were dying. And within weeks, the entire world was falling into war. That single failed morning operation, that accidental turn of a car, had transformed into the spark that lit the largest conflict humanity had ever seen. When people say history turns on small hinges, this is the kind of hinge they're talking about. The reaction from Vienna was swift and filled with a sense of righteous outrage. The Austro-Hungarian government blamed Serbia, not only for the assassination, but for supporting the nationalist movements that threatened the empire. They issued a 10-point ultimatum so severe that no sovereign nation could fully accept it. Serbia agreed to 9 of the 10 demands, a remarkable concession by any standard, but Austria-Hungary had never expected or even wanted compliance. They were looking for a reason to strike, and with the full backing of Germany, a support often described as a blank check, they saw the moment as their opportunity. What followed was not simply a diplomatic exchange, but the widening of a crack that had long existed beneath the surface of European politics. Russia moved to support Serbia. Germany prepared to support Austria-Hungary. France aligned itself with Russia. Britain watched nervously as the situation spiraled, and all of it stemmed from that one encounter on a city street, an encounter that none of the great powers had expected, but all of them would pay for. As an old historian, I often reflect on how strange it is that the greatest storms in human history can begin with something so small. This chapter reminds us that history is not written only by emperors or generals. Sometimes it is shaped by a coincidence, a misstep, or a single young man standing in the wrong place at exactly the right moment. As we move forward in our story, we shift our gaze from the streets of Sarajevo to the war rooms of Europe, where generals and statesmen attempted to shape the world with maps, calculations, and assumptions that would soon unravel. Among all the plans devised before the First World War, none was as ambitious or as influential as Germany's Schlieffen Plan. Designed years before the crisis erupted, it was meant to give Germany the advantage in a conflict that its leaders believed was inevitable. The plan rested on a simple idea: to defeat France quickly, ideally within 6 weeks, before Russia could fully mobilize its enormous army. German strategists believed that Russia, with its vast territory and outdated infrastructure, would need much more time to prepare. If Germany could knock out France first, it could then turn eastward and face Russia with its full strength. To accomplish this, Germany chose not to attack directly through the heavily fortified Franco-German border, which was lined with strong defensive positions that would slow any offensive to a crawl. Instead, German generals decided to swing their armies northward and march through Belgium, a neutral country that they assumed would offer little resistance. This sweeping maneuver was meant to deliver a decisive blow, encircling French forces and capturing Paris before the French army had a chance to organize a proper defense. It was a plan that required precision, speed, and the cooperation of variables far beyond Germany's control. But history, as it so often does, had other ideas. The first major flaw in the Schlieffen Plan revealed itself almost immediately. Belgium did not quietly step aside. Instead, Belgian forces resisted with remarkable courage and determination. Their defense slowed the German advance, buying precious time for France and Britain to respond. The world had underestimated Belgium, and Germany now found itself facing a delay it had not planned for. This resistance also triggered one of the most critical political consequences of the conflict. Britain, which had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality for decades, declared war on Germany in response to the invasion. What Germany had expected to be a quick march through Belgian territory now pulled the British Empire fully into the conflict. Meanwhile, France began to recover from the shock of the initial German strike. As German troops pushed deeper into French territory, they stretched their supply lines and created gaps in their formation. In early September, along the Marne River, the French launched a bold counterattack. It was a moment when the fate of the war hung in the balance. The French and British forces managed to halt the German advance, forcing the German army to retreat and abandon its original plan for a swift victory. The battle marked the end of Germany's hopes for a rapid defeat of France. What had been expected to be a short war now began to transform into something far more prolonged and brutal. At the same time, events elsewhere in Europe were unfolding with a rapid and unstoppable momentum. Russia began mobilizing sooner than Germany had anticipated, placing pressure on the Eastern Front. France, bound by alliance, was now fully committed. Britain had entered the war in defense of Belgium. Montenegro joined Serbia in resisting Austria-Hungary. What had started as a regional conflict in the Balkans was now spreading across the entire continent. The interconnected system of alliances acted like a chain reaction, drawing nation after nation into the conflict. The war was no longer a dispute between empires. It had become a continental struggle, one that would soon reach far beyond Europe itself. Looking back on this part of the story, I'm always struck by how differently events unfolded from how the planners had envisioned them. The Schlieffen Plan seemed elegant, logical, and efficient on paper, but war is never fought on paper. It is fought in landscapes of mud, in towns whose people refuse to yield, and in the unpredictable movements of millions of human beings. The plan, so carefully crafted in peacetime, crumbled almost immediately when confronted with the realities of war. And in that collapse, Europe slid further into a conflict that would reshape the world for generations to come. As the failure of Germany's quick victory became undeniable, the war began to shift into a form that few had imagined at the start. After the Battle of the Marne halted the German advance, both sides began searching desperately for an advantage. What followed became known as the race to the sea, a strange and exhausting maneuver in which the armies of Germany and the Allies each attempted to swing around the northern flank of the other. They marched, dug in, repositioned, and attacked again and again, trying to find an opening that would grant them the upper hand. But each time one side extended its lines northward, the other followed. Step by step, they dragged the front all the way to the shores of the North Sea. Once they reached the water, there was nowhere left to outflank. The armies found themselves locked into place, stretching across a line hundreds of miles long. It was a line that neither side could break. And from this frustration emerged something entirely new in the modern age: the vast and terrible system of trench warfare. To imagine the Western Front only as a pair of simple trenches is to misunderstand the scale of what was created. The trenches formed a complex, layered network that resembled the roots of an enormous tree spreading beneath the earth. There were frontline trenches where soldiers faced the enemy directly, support trenches behind them where reinforcements and supplies moved, and reserve trenches even farther back to house troops waiting for orders. These lines were connected by narrow communication trenches that carried messages, food, and sometimes the wounded. All of it was protected by thick coils of barbed wire that glittered like steel thorns under the grey sky. Fields were mined, pathways were hidden, and deep dugouts were carved into the earth to shield soldiers from the constant bombardment. In many places, the ground itself became a maze of sandbags, mud walls, and wooden planks laid over the wet soil. But the design of the trenches, impressive as it was, could not spare the men from the suffering that defined daily life on the front. The conditions inside the trenches were unlike anything many of the soldiers had ever experienced. Rats grew to enormous size, feeding on the unburied dead and thriving in the waste that collected in every corner. Rain turned the floors of the trenches into thick pools of mud that could swallow a man up to his knees, and sometimes deeper. Water stood for so long that soldiers developed a condition known as trench foot, where the skin softened, cracked, and risked infection simply because it remained wet day after day. Disease spread quickly in such an environment. Lice infested clothing, fevers swept through entire units, and the ever-present smell of decay settled into the air like something permanent. Above it all was the sound of the war itself. Artillery shells fell so often that many soldiers described the noise as a constant presence, something that no longer startled them but instead lived in the background of their minds. At night, flares lit the sky with bursts of white light, revealing the tangled landscape of craters and debris. And always hovering in the darkness was the fear that the enemy might launch an attack across the narrow strip of land separating the two armies, a place known grimly as no man's land. This ground, churned by explosions and littered with wreckage, was the stage on which countless assaults were attempted. Men would charge across it only to be cut down by machine guns, artillery, or the deadly webs of wire that waited for them. For all the suffering endured, the gains were often measured not in miles, but in yards. The war had turned into a brutal test of endurance. It was no longer about swift victories or brilliant maneuvers. Instead, it became a grinding struggle in which each side sought to exhaust the other. Looking back, it is striking how modern technology had led Europe into a conflict that pushed its soldiers back into something ancient. Despite the guns, the shells, and the new machines of war, the men lived like warriors from long-forgotten ages, buried in the earth, fighting for survival one day at a time. It is one of history's harsh reminders that even in an age of progress, war has a way of dragging humanity back to its most primitive fears. As the war settled into its grim rhythm on the Western Front, its influence began to spill far beyond the trenches of France and Belgium. What had started as a European conflict quickly expanded into a struggle that touched almost every corner of the world. When Japan entered the war on the side of the Allies, it moved swiftly to seize German territories across Asia and the Pacific. Places that had rarely been mentioned in European discussions suddenly found themselves caught in the wake of empires fighting for dominance. At the same time, battles erupted across Africa as European powers clashed over colonies that had long been symbols of prestige and ambition. And in the southeast, the Ottoman Empire, facing its own internal pressures and external threats, chose to join the conflict on the side of the Central Powers. Its entry opened new fronts in the Middle East, drawing the war out across deserts, mountains, and ancient cities. The conflict was no longer confined to the continent where it began. It had become a global storm. While armies marched and fought across these distant lands, another struggle unfolded in the minds of people watching from afar. The United States, at that time, declared itself neutral. Many Americans wanted to stay out of yet another European dispute, but neutrality did not mean ignorance. News reports, photographs, and personal letters traveled across the Atlantic, carrying stories of destruction that shocked the American public. In particular, the devastation in Belgium left a deep mark on the American imagination. People read about towns burned, civilians displaced, and the harsh realities of occupation. These images stirred anger and sympathy, slowly shifting public opinion even as the government maintained its distance. This war became one of the first in which communication itself played a central role. Governments crafted messages, shaped narratives, and use new technologies to influence both their own people and the world beyond their borders. It was, in many ways, the birth of modern strategic communication in wartime. As we reflect on these developments, it becomes clear that the First World War teaches lessons far deeper than maps or military maneuvers alone can show. This conflict did not explode because of one man's hatred or one nation's ambition. It arose from a system weighted down with alliances that locked countries into obligations they no longer fully understood. It grew from national pride that clouded judgment and from leaders who believed their nations were too strong to be threatened by their own decisions. The world had become interconnected in ways people did not yet grasp, and that interconnection turned every misunderstanding into something far more dangerous. The war reminds us that peace is never guaranteed. It depends on trust, humility, and the simple recognition that no nation, no matter how powerful, is immune to the consequences of its own actions. As an old historian looking back more than a century later, I often find myself asking the same question. Where is the line between confidence and blindness? Between believing in one's nation and ignoring the risks that pride can bring? It is a question without an easy answer, but it is one that grows more important with each passing generation. The world of 1914 believed it understood itself, yet it stepped into a tragedy that would reshape entire continents. And so, as we move into the final part of this reflection, it is worth remembering the deeper truths that history offers. A single gunshot in Sarajevo changed the color of the world. A conflict that many expected to be brief became 4 years of unimaginable loss. It was never simply the fault of one person or one country. It was the result of decades of rivalry, miscommunication, and the slow erosion of trust. For those who have lived long lives, especially many of you listening who have seen your own nation face hardship and renewal, the value of peace is something understood in the heart, not just in the mind. History is not written to find someone to blame. It is written to remind us of what human beings can lose when we forget how fragile our world truly is. As we close this chapter, I encourage you to reflect on the lessons of this past. Think about how the choices of nations and individuals ripple outward in ways none of us can fully predict. And if you wish to understand how this war unfolded over the next 4 years, I invite you to join me in the next part of this story, where we will follow the conflict into its darkest and most decisive moments.